Thank you, everyone. It is extraordinarily hard to see anybody in the audience, but I'm pretty sure we have a great audience out there. So thank you for joining us for this session, just a butting lunch. So we'll move through as efficiently as we can, but it's an extraordinarily important topic today, Australia's productivity challenge. And we have some great speakers that will address you, and we're looking forward to some Q&A. So as we go through, please don't hesitate to put your questions up on the system, and we'll get to those shortly. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that today's panel session is being held on the country of the Ngunnawal people, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for tens of thousands of years. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm Barney Glover, chair of this session. I'm also the Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney University, and in the near future, taking on a role with Jobs and Skills Australia. So I'm very, very pleased to have an opportunity to chair this session with a very esteemed panel, and hopefully to drill down on Australia's productivity challenge with a particular lens on the contribution of tertiary education and higher education in particular to that challenge. Our panel members, and I'll come back to introduce them more fulsomely in a moment, but we have Cherelle Murphy, the Chief Economist for EY Oceania, Catherine de Fontenay, the Commissioner with the Productivity Commission, Professor Robert Breunig, who is the Director of the Tax and Policy Institute at ANU, so a great panel. A few remarks from me to begin with, and then I'll introduce the panel members a little more fulsomely, and we'll get into some short presentations from each of the panel members before we go to Q&A. While Australia's economy has performed strongly in recent decades, domestic productivity has slowed since the mid-2000s. Over the decade to 2020, average annual labour productivity growth in Australia was the slowest in 60 years, falling to just 1.1% compared with 1.8% over the 60 years to 2019-20. The scale and the nature, of course, of the economic shock as a result of the pandemic is expected to have an enduring impact on Australia's productivity challenge. The uptake of technologies resulted in the growth of remote work, online commerce, businesses' digital presence, innovative delivery of services, particularly in health and education. Other factors, global barriers to trade and geopolitics more broadly, climate change and its impact, the heightened global tensions have all been drivers in the productivity challenge. The higher education sector has a key role to play in addressing Australia's productivity challenge, not just in the production of suitably skilled graduates, but in the partnerships it builds with government, business, industry and the community, and of course with the research it undertakes and the innovation it helps to generate. Universities, of course, can drive productivity in a range of ways, and we'll tease some of this out more fulsomely in the detailed presentations, and I'm sure in the Q&A. But of course, the relationship between universities and the tertiary sector more broadly and the jobs of the future. We had some great sessions this morning that began to touch on that issue around the jobs of the future and the role that universities can play in meeting the demands around the labour market and how it evolves. Of course, the quality of our graduates that we produce, the way in which we utilise our research and our expertise, the way we address barriers to the growth of R&D tax incentives, working with small businesses and enterprises to drive innovation, the importance of the SME sector, promoting, of course, the role universities play and our staff in particular play as consultants to government, providing evidence-based approaches and frameworks to address productivity challenges, and something the Productivity Commission has commented on, as has the Accord final report. In fact, the report of the 5-year productivity inquiry undertaken by the Productivity Commission, and I know Catherine will tease this out in her presentation, released in 2023, noted the importance of improved educational outcomes for future productivity growth, with more than 9 out of 10 jobs in the next 5 years requiring a tertiary education and 6 out of 10 jobs being deemed high-skilled. Both the inquiry report that I just referred to and, of course, the Accord report focus on the significance of providing access to tertiary education to people who, under current settings, are denied that opportunity, and note the economic and social benefits of allowing them to have that access and to participate more fully. The demand-driven system, implemented from 2009-10 to the end of 2017, was successful in significantly increasing student numbers, including those from historically underrepresented backgrounds, and it responded effectively to meeting most skill shortages. There was no doubt it contributed to productivity and economic growth in GDP. Criticisms of the DDS in that period included the relationship between an unfettered growth in higher education and whether or not underprepared students, for example, were entering higher education in universities, and of course, whether we had designed a system that was truly meeting labour market needs as opposed to a system purely demand-driven. A broader examination of the sectors into which universities provide graduates in excess numbers should be undertaken, with a more targeted approach considered, and that was certainly touched on in the Accord report. That report suggests, in summary, a managed demand-driven system for the future, a more planned and managed system to guide us over the next 25 years as we seek to address some of the very significant challenges in the jobs of the future, the skills of the future, and the demands that the Productivity Commission and others have already highlighted. The recommendation to government to form an Australian Tertiary Education Commission as a way of stewarding the implementation of the recommendations accepted by government from the Accord is one such measure to provide us with a greater sense of management and planning around the growth of higher education. The Commission would also play a central role in managing enrolments at the system level, to planning at the university level, as I said, stewarding the system overall in consultation with universities through mission-based compacts. Based on this approach, there would be an expansion in the system to meet student demand and skills needs without a doubt, and we've highlighted that in the Accord, Mary O'Kane's final report. However, it would not come through a reduction in quality and admission standards, and it's something we might touch on here in our sessions today, the relationship with the quality of our system and productivity. So we're going to tackle today's productivity conversation with a number of different perspectives on addressing the challenge we face. Each of our speakers will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes and we'll take Q&A. I'd just like to introduce the panel members in a little more detail. Cherelle Murphy is the Chief Economist with EY Oceania. Prior to EY, Cherelle was the Chief Economist at Austrade, helping to guide Australian government policy in trade, foreign investment and tourism. She also spent 15 years at the ANZ Bank, having started her career as an economic research analyst at the Reserve Bank of Australia. She's worked as a journalist for the Australian Financial Review. Catherine de Fontenay has been a Commissioner of the Productivity Commission since 2019. She led the Commission's work on higher education as part of its 2023 Productivity Inquiry. She's led Commission research into labour markets, aged care, child and family services, bequests, supply chains, business credit and business innovation. Prior to joining the Commission, she held academic positions at the University of Melbourne, NYU and the University of New South Wales. And Professor Robert Breunig is one of Australia's leading public policy economists. His research is motivated by important social policy issues and debates, and his work is characterised by careful empirical study and appropriate use of statistical techniques. He's worked in partnership with government organisations in Australia and overseas, including with the Australian Treasury, Department of Employment, Department of Industry, the Department of Communication and the Arts, Productivity Commission, of course, and the Bureau of Stats. He's been a consultant to the private sector on marketing, mergers, bank competition and customer loyalty programs. We have a great panel today. Would you please welcome them to begin? Cherelle, Catherine and Robert. And we're going to ask Cherelle to give a few comments first from the chairs and give us perhaps a high-level view of productivity and the challenges, and then we'll go from there. Cherelle.
Thank you very much, Professor Glover. And I will start from my perspective as a macroeconomist, and the news isn't good. As you noted, growth has been declining over some time. And if we were to look right up to the up-to-date figures, which come from the national accounts, in the year to the September quarter, labour productivity growth in Australia actually fell by 2.1%. And in the market sector, which takes out the sort of government and the health sector, it's not quite so bad, falling by about 0.9%. But nevertheless, pretty stunningly woeful, unfortunately. When we think about the 60-year average of the productivity growth numbers up to 2020, it did grow by about 1.7%. So just to give you a point of comparison. But we're not alone. Australia, of course, has suffered this productivity decline like many other advanced economies around the world. One exception recently is the US productivity numbers have actually picked up quite stunningly. So it'll be interesting to see if that lasts and what lessons, if any, we can take from that. So why does productivity matter? Well, high productivity, of course, means that we kind of get more for less. It takes pressure off government fiscal positions. It allows faster real wage growth without adding to the Reserve Bank's dilemmas. Essentially, it allows us a better standard of living. And it's no surprise then that Paul Krugman said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. Daniel Wood, also from Productivity Commission, as I'm sure you know, makes the point that productivity remains the secret source of higher incomes. And that might mean that we can get more stuff, but it also means that we can get higher standards of living through lower infant mortality rates, through more education for our young people, and also, of course, longer life expectancies as well. So there's lots that's good about productivity. So why has productivity growth fallen across most of the advanced world in recent years? Well, a large part of the explanation, recently anyway, has of course been the pandemic. This really is kind of almost mathematical because, of course, what happened when we got into the depths of the pandemic is that governments around the world and central banks flooded their systems with stimulus, and that caused a big surge in jobs growth, a big surge in hours worked, but GDP didn't keep up. So if we measure labour productivity simply as GDP per hour worked, mathematically that means that you get a fall in productivity. So the good news from that is that, of course, a lot of that should unwind. And in fact, when we see the national accounts next week, we probably actually will see a productivity growth number that picks up again. So at least in the quarter, at least in the December quarter. Now, does that mean anything? Not really. It doesn't really help us analyse the core of the problems, but it does suggest that we need to be a little bit careful about how we think about productivity from a macroeconomic perspective. The other thing that the pandemic did was it caused a bit of a shift in the industry mix in advanced economies. So there was much more priority, of course, on the health and social services industries as we needed to put in place a health response to the pandemic. That meant that industry sort of increased as a share of the economy relative to others, such as mining. And it's not a high productivity industry. It's an incredibly important industry, of course, but its output is much lower than something like mining. And mining, by the way, is by far our biggest product and most productive industry. In fact, the mining sector is 10 times more productive than the average of all others. So when you see a change in the industry structure of the economy, then you will, of course, start to see some changes in the productivity numbers on average. So the bad news, I guess, from that is that we won't necessarily see a shift in that going forward. Yes, we might see a kind of a small decline in the health and social services sector relative to some of the other industries. But just as I was reading through the Accord yesterday, I noticed a really interesting chart in there that showed that the health and social services industry was expected to grow by about 533,000 people over the next 9 to 10 years. And the next industry down was only about 233,000 people. So it just shows that that industry will, of course, continue to be very dominant in our economy and many others as the population ages. Of course, as we require more from our health and our social services sector for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we simply demand more of the products and services that are produced by that sector. But as the dust settles from the pandemic, I think we have to ask ourselves, what happens next? Well, the sad reality is probably not much. We will continue to sort of observe low productivity growth rates unless we change, unless we put in place policies and practices which will promote productivity growth going forward. And that, of course, is a combination of work by governments, by business, by the university sector. So what is this secret ingredient, I hear you ask? Well, I would probably put it into 4 different buckets. You've got technology change, you've got skills and education, competition and regulation. Now, this is a simplification, but to me, as a macroeconomist, this makes more sense. So if we look at the first of those buckets, which is technology change, I think probably best to illustrate this, of course, by an example, and how can I go past generative AI? It is leading to a substantial change in knowledge and also information work. The studies that we have so far, and of course, we're quite early in this journey, suggest that it really does improve output and the quality of output across multiple sectors. And of course, here universities have an enormous role to play, given they have the experience and the infrastructure and the expertise to lead the development of AI. I, in fact, had a conversation last week with a professor at ANU who was telling me how she'd use a generative AI framework to accentuate her research and take it to the next level, and more quickly too. And I was sort of sitting there quite blown away as she was walking me through this on her laptop sitting at the cafe. For fun, I thought, I'm going to put into the EY's version of ChatGPT. We have our own kind of trademark version. Write me a 7-minute speech on productivity with an emphasis on universities and throw in some funny jokes on Taylor Swift. It was quite good, but it was 27 references to Taylor Swift songs, and I thought that was probably a step too far for this audience, even for me. Secondly, if I look at the second bucket, which I referred to, which is skills and education, the economic research will tell us that skilled employees who know the latest research and knowledge and who adopt new ideas, new processes and new technologies and bring them into their firms allow their firms to absorb that extra information, and it increases their capacity. And of course, how do you get there? Well, often you get there with a university degree. What they essentially, the research shows, is that those that take the ideas of others and adapt them to their own firms are going to move right up that productivity frontier much faster than those that sit still, of course. So in other words, we don't need to be the ones inventing everything, but we do need to be the ones using it. And this is incredibly important. Number 3 bucket, competition. So I love the work of Rod Sims in this area, who speaks very passionately about the subject. And of course, through the last few decades, we've seen a breakdown in many of the regulations and monopolies in our economy, which have caused us to be less productive than we otherwise might have been and stopped us from reaching our potential. But of course, there's more work to be done here, and the government is looking into this, of course, at the moment with its competition policy review. Certainly, you don't expect necessarily every merger or every monopoly in an economy to be sort of destabilising that economy, but some will be. And so we need to remove those, market structures that, again, are stopping us from reaching our potential. And fourthly, in the bucket of regulation, I think, again, lots of examples here of where we've kind of got it wrong, or we're not quite getting it right yet as we sort of understand the impact of regulation on our productivity. So we think about the most, productive business environments are those that allow dynamism in an economy. And that means a lot of things. It could mean, for example, an economy that allows businesses to enter and to exit the business environment as easily as possible. So, that means, again, just taking restrictions out of the way. Companies that workers who also move between firms, they take the knowledge with them. They share it with new and productive firms. And again, that does create productivity benefits. Again, we can see this in the data, and really referencing the work here of E61, which is a fantastic research institute here in Canberra that does a lot of work on this. So again, there are kind of regulatory restraints that stop this from happening in the economy. And think about non-compete clauses as just a really simple example. Not only are these in place for workers, I guess, such as myself in professional services, but apparently they also exist for yoga instructors and hairdressers. Really, is this what is this where we should be at? Is this really in the best interest of economy? I very much doubt it. So I think there's lots for the university sector to input into each of these, some more than others. I think that point about skills, the ability to adopt new technology and new ideas, potentially one of the most important from a macro point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherelle. I'm glad you brought Taylor Swift into that. That would have been disappointing in this session if we didn't have a reference to Taylor Swift and productivity. Catherine, we might go to you. I think you're going to have some slides. Do you want to work from the lectern? So, Catherine, over to you.
As a former academic, I love a good slideshow. I'm a little confused as to how I do that.
That's a very good question. You would think it's... Well,
I'm just going to...
Someone shows... See, the slide is up there.
Oh, that one? Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about productivity in general and also how that relates to the higher education sector. So because of all the talk about productivity, it has acquired a certain mysticism over the last couple of years, and it's worth bearing in mind that it's a very simple concept. So when we're talking about labor productivity, essentially we're saying the value of the output, the goods and services that we produce per worker hour. And so how do we improve labor productivity, that depressing measure that is going in the wrong direction at the moment? So we have firms using workers and using capital, tangible and intangible, to produce goods and services. How can we improve our labor productivity? Well, we can have more capital, and that's a worry right now because investment is stagnating, so that may not be the secret sauce this year. We can improve existing processes. We can produce more efficiently in the ways that we currently are. And so there we look at the business environment, industrial relations, whether some firms have too much market power and it's an anti-competitive environment, all those aspects of the business environment. We can innovate and absorb new innovations from overseas and do things better. And then, of course, the last lever that we can pull is we can provide more skills to our workforce. And obviously, that's a big part of where universities come in. So universities and the vet sector are essentially playing a role in two categories. One is in providing us with more skilled labor. And the important thing to bear in mind is there's a quantity dimension and a quality dimension there. So quantity is what the University Accord has been talking about, expanding the number of students who have a vet degree or a university degree, possibly more students going on to advanced degrees. But the thing to bear in mind is that that has a significant opportunity cost. So if we have a young person taking 2 years out to do a master's at the most hardworking, innovative time of their life, then that is potentially very costly. And then on the quality, when we are delivering a degree to someone, can we deliver a better degree? That's the quality dimension. The other place that universities play a role, of course, is on the innovation side. And it's important to bear in mind that even there, the primary vector by which universities affect innovation is through delivering better graduates. So graduates who are going to be able to adopt innovation from overseas, going to be able to innovate themselves, those graduates are the main vector. And for example, something that's been looked at a lot in Australia is managers and the quality of our managerial skills. That's been a real handbrake on innovation and growth in a lot of firms. Of course, research is another important vector by which innovation diffuses out to domestic firms. And we've tried to emphasize in the productivity inquiry that that needs to happen not just through joint ventures, which government's traditionally been very excited about, so university, industry, startups, and joint ventures, but also through the more pedestrian vehicle of consulting. A lot of universities make it very difficult for their faculty to consult and share ideas and expertise with local businesses, and we've encouraged that to change. So on quantity, the Productivity Inquiry in 2023 agreed with the University Accord that we should move to more of a demand-driven system. How that should be paid for is up for debate, but one option is to increase the student contribution. Again, the beauty of the HEC system is that these are income contingent loans. The amount of repayment depends on the amount of your income, so that does allow a lot more flexibility than in some other university systems. However, we would like to stress that it is vital to expand HEC's loans into the VET system with careful guardrails around that expansion. Because if we do not, we are creating a systematic bias in the choice of young people. So if young people can go to university for free in the short run, but have to find the funds up front for some of the VET degrees they might be considering, that creates a systematic bias in the system. So we need to address those two things at the same time. So now I want to make myself very unpopular and discuss quality. So I think we all have to acknowledge that universities have relatively weak incentives to provide quality in teaching. I'm not speaking about academics here. They've always had weak incentives to invest in teaching rather than research, and we still have to keep herding the cats. But universities, their ranking and the demand of students is primarily driven by research. And so the quality of the teaching has very little impact on their demand, their profits, their future growth. And that creates a potential tension. In looking at the QUILT results, we found that there was a significant share of students who are very dissatisfied with their university experience. That's a concern. And I think we all have to acknowledge that the transition to more online learning presents a huge challenge. And it's one that all of us worry about a lot of the time, but we worry about it perhaps when we think about the student experience and sort of satisfaction of the student with their degree. It's also a quality of learning issue, for sure. So what we know about research about online is that online done well, extremely high quality materials that are tailored to the student's level, great face-to-face contact that supplements those online sessions, that can be much better for learning than our traditional ways of teaching. But just doing what we did face-to-face with a lecturer talking to a number of blank screens, that is not better than the traditional face-to-face interaction. And it's proving to be a source of great frustration, disengagement and frustration for students, huge frustrations for teachers that actually do enjoy teaching, and the experience of teaching has gotten a lot less fun for a lot of academics. And there's just the potential for a very poor quality product. So it's vital that universities not view moving to online as a cost-saving device. It's vital that there be big investments in the upfront production of high-quality materials, of purchasing high-quality materials from overseas, of blending those with face-to-face. That's going to require lots of investment, possibly different contractual relationships with their staff. It's going to be big and complicated, and at the moment, it's not going particularly well. So we have to grapple with that transition. And I think it's safe to say that some academics, the main thing that drove them to teach well were the people awkwardly shifting in their seats in front of them, as you are doing right now. And in a world where the costs of delivering a bad lecture or putting up bad materials goes way down because you don't interact with the students, then there are potentially some big risks. So this is a challenging time. I'll skip the statistics, but I just want to mention that the PC made some recommendations on quality that were somewhat different to the ones made in the University Accord, and I personally think some of them are still well worth considering. One is expanding QUILT, expanding the student experience surveys and making those results more prominent when students are choosing a university. That creates stronger incentives for universities to pay attention. Again, if we think of, say, universities that teach MBAs, MBA programs hire teachers that are good teachers because they have very strong incentives to deliver teaching quality. Increase external quality assurance. So this could be TEXA, this can be the internal processes of universities in collaboration with TEXA. We think that lectures, now that they're all online and materials are online, that should be freely available within the university. That at least creates some potential reputation mechanisms as students can use those to choose classes. TEXA could also use those in order to evaluate a random sample of classes. So we'd love to see a more hands-on approach to regulating this sector. As the Accord has suggested, there could be a body for student complaints, and there can be more research and training into teaching. So there's a number of levers that we can pull to affect that quality dimension, and we think they're very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Now, I was anticipating a flush of questions on the basis of your provocative comments, Catherine, which I'm glad you made. So I'm looking forward to a few questions coming through, because I think there's a great deal in what Catherine said that we need to reflect on from the Productivity Commission reports, but more generally, as we come out of the COVID era, the way we're shaping teaching and learning in universities. So I'm looking forward to them. I'm not seeing them on my screen, but I know they're coming. Robert, over to you for some final comments before we go to Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Glover. Thanks for your introduction, and thanks, Cherelle and Catherine. Those are good comments to jump off from. Patrick Cummins from the Isles was here. I want the other journalists to pay attention too. I've solved the problem. So I've got a new class called Productivity 101. Anybody takes my class, and Australian GDP automatically goes up by 0.1% per student. So I think we're done. And for those of you who laughed, thank you. That was a joke. But it was illustrating the way we talk about productivity, which I think is kind of problematic sometimes, right? You can't regulate productivity. You can't command productivity. The government can't stand up and say, hey, be more productive. All the government can do, and universities to some degree, is set the settings. And as Cherelle pointed out, in Australia, we do a lot of innovation. We invent some things that are new to the world, but 95% of our innovation in Australia is adopting innovation from overseas. It's coming up with new ways to solve the problems we already have and doing that better. Who does that well? People that have a university education, people that can think nimbly, people that can think creatively, people that can solve problems. It's not about getting a STEM degree. It might be about getting a nursing degree. Right? Our treasurer, our Secretary of Treasury, Stephen Kennedy's first degree was nursing. I think the VC of Wollongong, her degree is nursing, right? It's not about a particular class or a particular degree, and we too often talk about it in that way. I've been here, 25 years in Australia. I just got my 25th medal from the ANU last year. And I'm still frustrated by sometimes the fact that we talk about universities as if they're vocational, as if what we're doing is kind of, preparing people for a particular career. I'm not preparing people for careers. I'm preparing people to go out and deal with something that I can't even predict. I can't predict the jobs of the future. But what I can do is create students who are literate, who are numerate, who know how to solve problems, who know how to think on their feet, who are open-minded, who are going to adopt other ideas. That's got to be the key way that universities are going to lead to productivity. Notwithstanding the things, Catherine, you said were also absolutely part of what we have to do. So, where I think are the areas where Australian universities really stand out. I think one of them is in immigration. One of the things we know from the international literature, and this is true in Switzerland, it's true in the US, it's true in Australia, immigrants are much more likely to file patents than people who are native to the country. Immigrants also bring an alternative perspective on things. They bring new ideas, they bring other solutions, they bring connections and networks that go beyond the 25 million people in Australia. And Australian universities are a great conduit that bring really high-skilled people to Australia and then actually skill them up even further. And a lot of them stay here, and a lot of them make a huge contribution to this country. And so I think that's something really important that we do. I might leave it there. Those are just a few comments to, I guess, get ideas going. And I think I want plenty of time for questions. So
thanks, Robert, and thank you to all of our panel for those comments. We have about 20 minutes for discussion. I might kick off with a couple of quick things while people are reflecting. We've got some interesting questions coming through, and we'll try and work our way through those shortly. Catherine, I wanted to just chat to you about, in the United States, we're seeing the Biden administration doing a great deal to invest in the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. These are issues of sovereign risk to the United States. They're driving investment in industry. They've certainly got flow-on effects into universities. I'm sure they'll have flow-on effects into productivity. How should Australia respond to that? And in our economic circumstances in the global context? And what does that mean, potentially, whether or not we respond to it directly, to productivity in Australia?
Great question. That is a challenging one. Well, again, at the risk of being provocative, the Biden administration has written a large check to some industries that are now going to be much more affordable for us, and we should say thank you. So it does pose challenges for industries that are in Australia and competing head-to-head with, say, the battery manufacturing industry in the United States or the electric vehicle industry in the United States. However, most of what we do in Australia is complementary to the industries that are being subsidized. And so in the main, it's very good news for us. It will mean increased demand, in particular for our mining products, and hence some productivity benefits. And it will mean that we can continue to specialize in areas such as high-skilled services, which are one of the areas of comparative advantage in our economy. It's very tempting to sort of think, well, they've made this big investment and we need to respond, but Australia and the United States are not competing firms in the same industry. So economies are broad and diverse, and the benefits from trade are from specializing in diverse things and then reaping the gains from trade. So it's important not to sort of view it as a head-to-head competition.
Great, no, thank you. I'm very interested, Cherelle, in picking up your comment, and Catherine's comment then touched on it, which related to the structure of our industry sectors and productivity. And you mentioned mining 10 times more productive. So if you wanted to increase Australia's productivity, focus on mining, because you've got a tenfold opportunity to leverage it up. But the other figures you quoted shows a shift, and a shift that is picked up in the Accord. We're going to see many, many more people drawn into the health and personal care industry, service industries over the next decade and beyond. Does that mean we should be resetting what we believe is the appropriate productivity change for this country, or should we still drive for 1.8 and above? Or do we need to reset because our economy is changing?
That's a good question too. What we definitely shouldn't be doing is dictating what our industry share should be so that we get good productivity numbers. That would be foolish. I think there is definitely a case for that. I think sort of resetting based on that industry share would be reflective of the fact that we know that there will be more growth in those lower productivity industries. But at the same time, I think you have to accompany that by a sort of more general proposition that we should be trying to lift productivity across the board. And we can do that. You know, we know that we can do that. So I think it would go hand in hand with a more general kind of agenda to sort of fix those buckets that I was talking about.
Just think we need to be careful how we judge good and bad in the context of a changing set of economic circumstances. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's also the case that productivity in these non-market sectors, health, education, is very poorly measured at the moment. And so we need to do more work to see what the productivity actually is. The PC will be releasing some work on health productivity in the near future, and actually it looks pretty good.
Very good. Excellent. Look forward to that. Perhaps before we go to a couple of the questions here, I wanted to pick up, and actually one of the questions touches nicely on this. It talks about work-integrated learning, improving the quality of teaching and learning. To come to your point, Catherine, Robert might like to comment on this as well. And the Accord has, of course, the final report has a great deal in it around recommendations to address both the extent of work-integrated learning, earn while you learn models, how we address, for example, placement poverty as an impact. There's professional accreditation challenges in Australia that impact on some key sectors. So I'd be very interested in any other reflections on, is that enough? How critical is it to driving quality in our graduates? And where's the balance point, I guess, in the extent to which we're putting emphasis on work-integrated learning across our courses, not just in the obvious ones, nurses embedded in that context. Catherine, do you want to touch on that?
Sure. Look, I think work-integrated learning has incredible potential to increase quality because it sharpens the focus of the university in terms of what skills are being developed that are valuable to the employers. I think the challenge is how to make that work in a large university model. So, University of Waterloo has a fantastic engineering degree where people work and do their degree, take terms on and off, and it's incredibly successful, but it's very small relative to an engineering program here in Australia, is my understanding. And so building up the contacts within industry in order to get students into effective placements and make those placements really useful for the student and for the firm, that's not a short operation. So it's something that we should start, but perhaps start with smaller disciplines with a smaller volume of students.
Robert, do you want to touch on this one?
I think it also demands a kind of engagement with industry that can sometimes be difficult to achieve. I think there are a lot of small things you can do. I think you can, there are a lot of possibilities for internship programs, for secondments, for bringing people from industry into the classroom to help teach. But I think it does involve a bit of coordination. And I think once you scale it up, as Catherine says, it actually becomes quite difficult. I think a lot of this also happens organically. So I see a lot of the consulting firms, for example, reaching into our second and third year undergraduate cohorts, hiring them prospectively for 18 months or 2 years away, giving them an internship during the summer. And so some of this can be market driven as well.
Yeah, in fact, EY was recently announced as the top employer of graduates, and one of the things that we do is we do exactly that. We reach in before they've even finished the last year of their undergraduate, offer them some work over summer. In fact, our office here in Canberra is teeming with people with lots of energy and some great spirit over December and January. I did that myself with the Reserve Bank, and when I was in my third year of study, I lived in Perth, came over to Sydney, did a project with the RBA, went home and finished my honours. So I think it's a very sort of proven way of engaging graduates, giving them real life problems to solve, and also just giving them a taste of what it's like to work.
To pick up Robert's comment about organically, I think the Accord focus is we can't afford this to be organic because of the scale and the extent to which we have to improve work-integrated learning across the curriculum, and which means we need a much more systematic approach. We need to bring business and industry into the conversation. The Business Council has commented on this. So those opportunities are wonderful. We need them on scale, particularly as we look at the number of graduates we're going to need over the next decade and beyond. So we've got to move from organic to systematic, widespread and deeper, I think, for the benefit broadly of the economy, and I'm sure for productivity. So that's one of the keys. We've got some interesting questions coming in, which I might go to now. There's an interesting one here. I think it refers to an article in The Economist which suggested that we've massively overstated the importance of research on driving productivity. Are we over-focused on it, and should we rethink the way we consider the impact of research on productivity? Catherine, do you want to have a comment on this?
It's a hard measurement problem, but I think the main takeaway for a small country like Australia is the point that Bob made, that most of the innovation and research that we will use in Australia is not produced by Australian universities, it's produced overseas. And so what we need are mechanisms to find out about that research, to bring it into our firms. Now, our universities here can be one of those conduits. So academics here are going to be more aware of what research is taking place overseas than perhaps a firm is. Collaborations, consulting, all of those are vectors by which we can help get that research into firms.
The translation aspect. Robert?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the research that this is referring to, but I guess I am a little suspicious of taking government money and giving it to universities and saying, use this money to commercialize research. The first question I would have is, if this research is valuable, why isn't the market doing this already, right? In the US, the market does this, right? And then people say, oh, it's a cultural issue. I don't know. I see lots of Australians who are happy to make lots of money. I'm not sure it's a cultural issue. Maybe it's something else, right? And, somebody asked about the university's own internal productivity and effective use of resources. And, universities are incredibly highly regulated. They have become very, very large, unwieldy bureaucratic structures. The number of professional staff to academics in Australian universities is a much higher ratio than it is in the US. So I think there's a lot of inefficiencies in the university system. You thought you were going to be unpopular. That we can, and so I'm not surprised that some efforts of this type would fail.
It's interesting to pick up, actually, it's probably not for this session, seeing we're running out of time, but to look at some international comparators of professional staff to academic staff ratios, and to look at changes over time, particularly in European universities, where you've seen a shift towards more and more professional staff, often correlated with regulatory and other requirements being placed on universities.
I have a visiting position at a university in France, and it's one of the best things that I do, because when I come back, I'm so happy to be at the ANU.
Well, we might come back, but there is actually a very interesting set of questions emerging about, and it's a point we touched on earlier, around understanding productivity within our sector, not just the impact we have on productivity more generally. We have an ageing academic workforce, we have insecure work, these are issues touched on in part in the Accord. To what extent, and you picked up issues of quality in the teaching and learning in Australia's universities, to what extent does that need to be addressed and considered in the context of driving productivity from universities? The nature of our workforce and the changes needed.
So I think increasingly a lot of the workforce will be a global workforce in universities. So the group of 8 universities hire from all over the world and will continue to do so. And I think more and more universities in Australia will do that. So I don't think the age composition of academia is a challenge for the whole world, particularly when the US abolished mandatory retirement. But so you might want to put in some mandatory retirement rules, but I think that
You're going to be really popular.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Just wait a few years.
Yeah. But I think that I don't think we need to address that directly. We do need to take a look at our teaching and casual teaching staff and see, is this an input to their learning, or are we is there a group of workers who are being poorly treated?
Well, I think we do need to consider, there are elements in the Accord report again that touch on the nature of how we support our academic staffing profile and how we reduce insecure work and a range of other things. There's an interesting question around, and we've talked a lot about it this morning, and it came up in Minister O'Connor's presentation, where he passionately put to this audience the importance of bringing our tertiary education system together rather than seeing much greater collaboration between higher education and vocational education and training. One of the, again, parts of the Accord report touches on the national skills taxonomy to better understand, if you like, the sort of fundamental atomised structures of vocational training and link that across into higher education in the curriculum context, so a better language between the two sectors. How important is it to push the collaboration between the two sectors? Is it marginally beneficial from a productivity perspective, or is it potentially a game changer? I'm not sure. Cherelle, do you want to start?
Look, I think it potentially is a game changer because, that collaboration is going to be more important as we go and try and sort of fix some of our biggest challenges. And here I'm thinking about climate change. We need, as Bob was saying, we need thinkers to solve some of the problems, but we also need a heck of a lot of electricians. We simply not set up for that. We simply won't meet those skills needs going into the future. To the extent that we're kind of working more holistically, and the two systems are working together, to me, it makes a lot of sense.
I think it's hugely important. I'm really excited about this idea of a national skills passport. So I think the difficulties in getting credit for work that you've done in the vet sector when you move to universities is a big barrier to people continuing their studies. I think difficulties in getting credit when you move from one university to another is a big barrier to you changing university if you're unhappy with the university that you're in. I think making that flow happen is critical. And you've mentioned in the Accord that you're keen to see, we all are keen to see more regional students and disadvantaged students have access to any educational opportunity that they want. We know that a lot of them use pathways. They might start in vet and move into university later. If we make those pathways flow well, I think it has huge potential.
I would just add that I think the European systems that work well, like in Germany, I think they do two things. One is there are ways to switch pathways that are relatively easy. But the second thing, a lot of this starts in K through 12. So vet in Germany is not like, oh, you're not good at school, go to vet, right? It's like, you meet people in Germany who haven't been to university, but they've been through the vet pathways to engineering and stuff. They have great math skills. They have great numeracy skills, right? So I really think we also need to be thinking about making sure that everybody in the economy has these really fundamental skills. And this starts before university.
Perhaps that's, before we have a final comment, just to pick that up. I mean, there are 3 reviews going on, have gone on. One has 2 of them completed. The Productivity Commission work around early childhood learning yet to be completed. How important is it for this government to think about productivity across that education spectrum rather than, yes, tertiary education has a role to play, but we've got to think this long term. So don't we need to see changes in our education system more broadly? Catherine, do you want to?
Yes, absolutely. So probably schools is easier to talk about because we have NAPLAN and PISA. We know that our PISA scores are going backwards. That's a big concern. And obviously that's going to pose a challenge for universities in terms of the training of the students that they're getting. So we absolutely want to address it across the whole educational life.
Robert?
Access to early childhood education for Indigenous kids and disadvantaged kids is going to be huge here.
Thanks, Robert. Cherelle?
I think, again, going back to that point that productivity is a long-term game and we need to be making difficult decisions now for the sake of our future. We're not going to see the results from this in the short term. The Accord, the competition review, the hard work that has to be done on tax policy, etc. These are all difficult politically, but it's really important for our long-term future.
Migration review as well.
Migration, and also so that we can compete in the world around us, because no other countries are doing the same. And if we sit back and do nothing, we'll simply fall behind.
That is a good place to stop because we have 17 seconds to go, and I know people would like to have lunch. But I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions that came in. Please join me in thanking our great panel, Catherine, Robert and Cherelle.
Thank you.